Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for staying for this last session. Christer and myself have the honor to close with a perspective on global energy systems and the role of renewables therein. Maybe to start off with what we clearly see is a shift both in consumer preferences and behavior on the demand side, illustrated by a big drive to changing transportation and vehicles preferences, as well as shifts in the investments decisions that companies are making when it comes to energy supply and the production of different types of equipment that are energy intensive. If we go beyond that and we ask ourselves, what is the global energy system going to look like? We start with the question on demand. And as McKinsey, we've done quite a robust exercise bottom-up, because we know that global energy demand is not forecasted by straight GDP correlation. So if you take 146 countries and 30 sectors and 55 different energy products, you try to understand the bottom-up trends, what we get to is the following picture. After a century of high growth rates in energy, primary energy demand, we're entering an era whereby we're expecting global energy demand to peak by around 2035. And if we try to ask ourselves the question why and what's behind this, obviously the energy intensity of economies and the energy efficiency of different sectors is what is at the core of this. In the same picture, we see that beyond the plateauing of total primary energy demand, there is a clear growth of renewables and a peaking of fossil fuels, with a difference between coal, oil, and gas. And Christer will elaborate a bit on the renewables part. If I take us forward to the second big trend behind the primary energy demand picture in aggregate, what is a very important factor that we need to consider is the overall electrification of energy demand. The total growth rate, or the growth rate per annum for electricity is going to be 2.1%, which is a seven times the growth rate of other fuels. And behind that are different sectors that have different degrees of electrification. So the first sector, buildings, or let me start with transportation, dependent on the speed with which cost parity will happen for different types of vehicles, light duty, medium duty, heavy duty, we expect from a virtually no electric vehicles on the road to grow, I'm looking at the clicking, where is it? To grow to a 27% electrification rate in transport. And then if we go to buildings, a combination of growing wealth in certain economies that allow to pay for more energy efficient appliances and more efficient cooling will see the electrification rate of buildings also grow by about half, from 30 to 45%. And then finally, also in industry, we'll see electrification of different industrial processes. So with that overall demand picture, which is a quite major shift in the way demand is going to be composed and the amount of electrification, I think the question, Christer, is what does that mean for the overall supply mix?
Yes. Thank you, Rashid. And the short story is that within this trend of strong electrification, a doubling actually of electricity demand from today until 2050, there is an equally strong trend of renewables growth. So from being a almost insignificant contribution 20 years ago, more than 50% of the new capacity installed, new power capacity installed the last couple of years has been solar or wind globally. Looking forward, the picture is very similar. So what we see until 2050 is that the share of power generation that comes from solar or wind is increasing from around 25% today to 50% in 2035, and then 75% in 2050. So a tripling of the share of renewable power generation as share of the total power generation capacity. The important thing to note is that this growth is increasingly driven by economics. So if you look at the cost of installing new renewable generation capacity, it is cheaper than installing alternative capacity, gas or coal-based or nuclear, in all markets we look at in 2020. So we've been modeling this for 150 different countries and regions, and the answer is always the same. The cheapest source of new generation capacity is a renewable source. If you go to the 2030, you will even see that for most markets, it's cheaper to build new renewable generation capacity than it is to use the existing gas or coal-based capacity, simply due to the cost of the gas and the coal. This means that the cost game, in a way, is over. It's already won by renewables. So now it's much more a discussion of system integration, how you deal with intermittent renewable generation capacity in systems where the share becomes hard. That's a different discussion that we will not go into today. What I would like to talk a bit about, though, is what are the implications from this energy shift in terms of CO2 emissions. And what we do see is that as the share of power grows, and within power it's more and more renewables, the implication is that oil demand is peaking around 2033, 2032 in the reference case. Gas demand is plateauing and eventually starting to go down, and coal demand is already going down. That means that CO2 emissions will also peak and actually start going down. This describes the reference case where CO2 emissions peaks at around 35-ish gigaton and going down towards 2050. This is still, however, quite far away from a 2-degree scenario, and let alone a 1.5-degree scenario. So while we see a peak, we're still far away from what climate scientists mean is a sustainable path. In McKinsey, we've actually done quite some work to understand what such a 1.5-degree scenario would look like. And I think the short answer is it requires a fundamental transformation of the energy system far beyond what we currently see. So to take some examples, by 2050, we need to get rid of all the coal-based generation and 80% of the gas-based generation. Alternatively, we need CCS. So that's the first one for the power system. For transport, road transport, we need 100% electric or green hydrogen by 2050. Marine, 50% non-emitting. Aviation, 75% non-emitting by 2050. For buildings, all the oil and almost all, 90% of the gas used for heating must move to zero carbon. And finally, for industry, which is, as Rashid showed, the sector where we see the least electrification, that needs to be significantly accelerated, and almost all, both low and high temperature heat must be electrified. This already looks like a big challenge to get there to 2050. The challenge is even bigger, realizing that 2/3 of this needs to happen the next 10 years. So 2/3 of the reduction must happen by 2030. I will end my part by talking a little bit about hydrogen, because hydrogen has the potential to play an instrumental role in such a scenario, both as an enabler of large-scale renewable integration. We've talked earlier today, I think, about the challenge of getting much intermittent renewable capacity into the system, especially on the seasonal basis. Hydrogen can help on that side. The other thing is that hydrogen can very much help on decarbonizing the end uses. So whether it's a transport, both on the road transport, but other transports as well, it's the heating system, it's the industry where already quite some hydrogen is used, but it can be, call it green or blue hydrogen, to reduce emissions and take away emissions. And of course, as feedstock, hydrogen could also contribute. With that, I leave it to Rashid to talk a bit about implications for the Middle East.
Thank you, Christer. And maybe as a last slide and last message, we see an opportunity for the Middle East to continue its energy leadership. And that is because of a few things. One is the fundamental underlying assumption for this is tremendous resource advantage, tremendous resource potential when it comes to solar, but also wind. And we've seen that in the bids in the Middle East. It means that there's an opportunity to continue an energy advantage that the Middle East has historically had. And that, if we look at the announcements of the governments of players in the region, seems to be happening. The announcements are large, and they are underpinned by strong fundamental economics. We've also seen, for example, in the latest bid announced by, or request for bids by Saudi Arabia, that there is an opportunity to localize. With the scale of rollout that is going to happen over the coming years in the region and the continuity of the rollout of new solar and wind parks, there's an opportunity to build new equipment and services industries for renewables around renewables. And in a region with a large need for economic diversification, new industries, that is a great opportunity. As a third point, many industries have been developed in the region because of advantaged gas positions. With affordable power, there is an opportunity to sustain that energy advantage and attract maybe also newer industries. And hydrogen is an example that is being explored in different parts of the region. And then finally, an important part of the sustainability question is water. And a region that is very dependent on water desalination is going to be extremely blessed with the opportunity to feed that desalination with attractive renewable production. And then maybe finally the link to oil and gas, which is a question we often get asked. Yeah, but we are an oil and gas region. What is this going to mean? If you look at, for example, Saudi Arabia, the amount of fuels that are still being used in power production, or if you use the amount of gas that is being used in other parts of the region, including imported gas, it is an opportunity to free up valuable liquids and gas, or avoid the import thereof, and monetize them with the highest economic netback for those resources. And then finally, as the region has some of its most attractive, from a cost perspective, oil and gas resources, there's an opportunity to lead the world not only in terms of cost competitiveness of the resources, but also in terms of carbon competitiveness of the actual oil and gas operations. Renewables might help to make sure that the oil and gas produced in the region are some of the lowest carbon emitting in the world. With that, Chris and I would like to thank you for staying with us until the very last moment as the last presenters. Thank you very much for your attention.